Welcome everyone to the Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds today. I'm really excited to have Dr. Jessie Mahoney here with us. I'll go ahead and introduce her and then we'll hand off for our presentation. So Dr. Jessie Mahoney is a certified physician coach, yoga and mindfulness teacher, physician wellness consultant, and board certified pediatrician. She is the founder of Pause and Presence, where she coaches physicians who are successful on the surface, yet struggle underneath. She leads CME wellness retreats, works with institutions, teams, and fellowships as a wellness consultant. She is a volunteer clinical professor of pediatrics at UCSF and the chair of the San Francisco Marin Task Force on Physician Wellness. She co-hosts the Mindful Healers podcast and speaks nationally on wellness and how to prevent and heal burnout. Dr. Mahoney worked for more than 17 years as a pediatrician, site chief of pediatrics, and chief of physician wellness at the Permanente medical group, Kaiser Permanente. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College and the University of California, San Francisco Medical School. And again, so grateful to have you here. Really excited to give this opportunity to everyone who's joining. So thank you very much, Dr. Mahoney. I'll hand it off to you for the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me. And hopefully this is going to be a fun, inspiring, energetic conversation. So my topic today is that medicine should be different and you can still make a difference. And as you mentioned, I'm a yoga teacher. So I always like to start with an intention. And my intention here today is to offer hope and inspiration. A little bit different than your usual Grand Rounds topics, and also share what I see as a different framework for thinking about burnout in healthcare and solutions for prevention and healing. And as I share my intention at the beginning, it's actually a very strategic way to start. And you're all psychiatrists, so you are focused on the brain. But my purpose in setting an intention is to direct your attention to those feelings of hope and inspiration, and also to tell your reticular activating system how to filter what I'm going to say over the next hour. And also, as I talk over the next hour, I'm going to talk a lot about how to use your brain for you rather than letting it go rogue and using it essentially non-intentionally. And so beginning strategically is the beginning of sort of deciding you can actually use your brain as physicians strategically in your practice of medicine so that you're not making something that's already pretty hard these days harder. My next strategic move is I'm actually not going to use slides today, because what I've discovered when I do talks on Zoom, if I use slides, you can't see me and you all turn your videos off and you start charting and you're not really paying attention. And so at least if I'm talking to you, you'll see my face and that will help you pay attention, hopefully. And because we're going to be talking about sort of human things and human conditions and individual struggles, that having a human face makes it a little bit more real and hopefully interesting. So my hope is that you will participate a little bit using the chat box, not just for questions, but I'm going to ask some questions of you so that you're interacting, because we know that if you interact, you'll actually take something away. And my goal today is to have you take something away. So I also strategically always acknowledge in every talk about wellness that the system is broken. And what I'm going to say doesn't mean that the system doesn't need to be fixed or that there are not problems and that we are not the victims of maybe unreasonable expectations in the world today. And that we are also, almost everyone that works in medicine is burnt out to some degree, and that there's a ton of moral injury in medicine. And I just throw that out there because my comments are not to say that those things don't need to be fixed, but that we can also make a difference in how we show up as physicians and clinicians in this work. I also want to acknowledge that the burnout is not your fault. And as you see, it's partly systemic and partly the way that we were trained to think that contributes to burnout. And so my invitation where we can make a difference is we can change how we show up for it, while hopefully the system gets fixed. And this system fixing, many physicians also see it as our responsibility, and it's not our responsibility. But if we want to be a part of it, we must be whole and healthy and think intentionally and strategically rather than be exhausted victims who are frustrated and reacting and lashing out, which is what happens when we get burnt out. So the definition of burnout in a technical sense is emotional exhaustion, and we don't make good changes in medicine when we're emotionally exhausted. It's cynicism, and generally we're not our best advocates when we're cynical and feeling like we're ineffectual. So that person doesn't make a good advocate to help fix the medical system. And so again, it's not your responsibility, but as physicians, I think we know the solutions. We are the people who care the most, and we have these smart, creative minds, and we do the work. And so if you want to be a part of the solution, I think you do really have to be understanding how we think and how to use your brain to help us come up with solutions. And so there are things that you can do strategically to help yourself do that if you want. And I also like to state at the beginning that those things will help you now in practice of medicine while that system is broken, while we hopefully wait for it to get fixed. Though it may not happen in my lifetime, maybe some of you it will. But the other thing is that even if the system changes, if we don't change how we think, we still won't be well, and we still will be burnt out and not happy. And so some of these tools are really taking agency for what we can control. And I like to offer this idea of the grass being greener where you water it. And so we can water the grass where we are and make it greener. And when we get somewhere different, we can also water the grass there. But the grass is rarely greener somewhere else, which is what we usually think. It takes this intentionality. So the official CME objectives are about recognizing thought patterns and communication habits that cause distress and burnout. And since I don't have slides, I'm going to read them just because I know you need to know what they are. Talking about the impact of shame, blame, and guilt on your physiology and your performance and burnout. And talking about the physiology of self-compassion and mindfulness and how you can use that to your advantage. And then I'm hoping you'll leave with some tools and strategies to help you find more satisfaction, joy, passion, purpose, whatever your word is, and less burnout in what I hope will be a longer, more sustainable career. So these tools that I mentioned, mindfulness, self-compassion, mindset work, and mindset work is essentially what we call physician coaching. It's a bit of a hot word these days, but what it means is using your brain strategically. And physicians have very smart minds, so we are great candidates for coaching. We also do incredibly hard work, and many other professions, everyone has a coach. It's kind of physician culture that we should do it all ourselves. So professional athletes, which I like in practicing medicine too, in many ways, our careers are longer, harder, and they demand a lot of us. They have coaches for everything. So these tools that I'm going to offer today are some tools in your toolbox that you can take with you. And I also like to think of them as that Japanese art form that's called kintsugi pottery, and I may not be saying it correctly, but it's when you repair the broken pottery with gold. And so if we feel broken, we can strengthen ourselves. And that repaired pottery is actually more valuable than in the beginning. And my invitation is that many of these tools we're going to talk about today, they will actually help you practice more sustainable, happy medicine, a happier mom, dad, husband, wife, parent, daughter, whatever other roles you have, they help you everywhere. Because the way that we were trained to think in medicine, we take that outside of medicine and it impacts everything else that we do. So my hope is that they're evidence-based interventions will actually help you. And there are quite a few studies about how they improve quality of life. And the quality of life improvements and less burnout come essentially from the Maslach burnout survey, if any of you have taken it. So my next strategic move in using your mind for you is to actually take a pause and just take a moment to breathe and arrive and focus on yourself. Slow down your nervous system. Get out of that fight or flight, sympathomimetic storm of perhaps a crazy morning. I don't know what all of you have been doing, but taking a moment to just settle and perhaps notice the soles of your feet or your ischial spines on your seat and come back to your breath. And just take 3 long, deep breaths. It doesn't have to be complicated. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And you can close your eyes if that feels good. always helps my body settle, because many of us who are always assessing people and situations, it helps your brain quiet. Just noticing how 3 deep breaths feel. And my next invitation would be to bring a hand to heart and another hand to top. Doesn't matter which hand, but hand on hand, hand on heart. And the reason that I offer this is there's science behind it. So the hand on your heart pressing in is releasing oxytocin, and that feels good. And so it's a way to just send yourself some feel-good hormones and an actual act of self-compassion. Recognizing that maybe you have a heart in there and it has some needs, and it's a human heart that has ups and downs and all the things. And that top hand, atop the bottom hand, if you rub that skin to skin, there are science studies recently that show that that decreases the cortisol in your saliva. So I like to envision it just melting as I do that. And taking 3 more deep breaths here, hand on heart, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And we'll do 2 more. And one last one. And when you feel ready, you can stay here a little longer if you need. You can lower your hands and open your eyes if they're closed, and just take a moment to notice how you feel. And that was less than 1 minute. And hopefully many of you feel a little bit different. And my invitation is that almost all of us can find 1 minute to pause and take a few deep breaths and practice a little mindfulness and self-compassion. It doesn't have to be 45 minutes on your mat. You don't need a long break. So trying it and noticing how maybe you feel more replete, maybe you feel a little more relaxed. And if anyone wants to reflect on that in the chat box, feel free. And my intention in the chat box with sharing it is that one of the things we know leads to burnout is isolation and feeling like you're the only one that feels that way. And we are trained not to be vulnerable. And so if you can practice being a little vulnerable and just sharing how something felt, it's like dipping a toe into that human connection. So my hope is that that will help you feel a little bit more connected to your colleagues, and maybe also share something, help seal in that it does feel good. So a little more background about me in the beginning, and I think you heard a lot of sort of how I got here. And when I share my wellness wisdom, I share it as I spent 17 years as the chief of physician wellness at Kaiser Permanente, or TPMG is what our doctor arm is called. And so I learned a lot of things there. I also learned a lot of things in my, I call it an operational role, maybe it's an administrative role, like as a chief of a department. And one of the reasons I did that role was because I wanted to try to figure out, well, how do you bring these two together? What I really learned is how they don't work together, and how you're always being taught opposites, and that much of the things that chiefs and medical systems and departments are being graded on are sort of anti-wellness. And so you actually have to kind of understand that there's this inherent conflict, but we also have to understand that you can lead with a lens to wellness. You can add wellness or caring for physicians or caring for yourself as something that's also important. It doesn't have to be a metric, because I think metrics are actually the opposite of wellness, honestly. But this idea that it's a value that we take care of ourselves, and that we can't take care of others if we don't take care of ourselves. The other bit about my wellness journey is that I actually got into coaching and mindfulness when I myself, as the chief of wellness and the chief of our department, was not well. And I like to just be vulnerable about that, because even though we maybe know what we're supposed to do, or there's a whole lot of lists of what you should do, wellness is not a checkbox, and life comes up and gets in the way. So at that time, I also had 3 teenagers, and I had a husband who struggled with significant depression. And I, in response, couldn't find anything in the wellness program that would help me. I couldn't find anything in the employee assistance program that would help me. And so I went back to yoga and essentially relearned how to breathe. And that was the first step. And I ultimately ended up as a yoga teacher, because I really wanted to understand, why did this work so well? Why did I feel better? And if it helped me in that setting, it could certainly help my colleagues. It could certainly help my patients. And I didn't actually have any intention of becoming a yoga teacher, but here I am. And I find it actually critically important to everything I do, because we can't separate out our physical body and our brain. Though as doctors, we try to. We have no physical needs. We can just willpower our way through things, but it's not sustainable. And I hired a coach, and what I found, it was not a physician coach because they didn't exist at that time, but it really helped me begin to see the world differently and understand why I saw the world differently than others. And I realized how I was making this thing that was clearly really hard, much harder on myself. And so I ultimately made changes, but I also ultimately saw that what we needed for physicians was really looking at how we think and how we can change it. So, my original interest in wellness before I even got into that role, I think is important because it's going to remind you of how we got here. And as a med student, I noticed that even at UCSF, which was super forward thinking, we as doctors had no physical or emotional or mental needs. And yet we spent all day talking to our patients about what they needed. And all the things we told our patients to do, we were just supposed to ignore and not do ourselves. And that didn't really make a lot of sense. And so I grew up in Berkeley and immediately started saying, like, what is this? And speaking up. And then I went to residency and it was even worse, where we didn't need to sleep. We didn't need to eat. We didn't need to see our families. We didn't need to use the restroom. And so by the end of that, I actually immediately started my practice and was someone who was like, we have to change this. And as a brand new doctor, I ended up in charge of physician wellness because it wasn't something that even existed and no one believed it was important. And I will say that because of the way we're trained to think in medicine, when this first started, we were in the back closet. There was not a window. There was not a penny of support. And we were a little bit like that Voldemort in Harry Potter, like that. Those people are talking about things in the background that are going to destroy medicine as we know it, when really it's clear over time that it's essential. And so I say all this because if you think about it, we were trained in med school and residency to think in a certain way, and then we carry that into the rest of our careers. And unless we stop to notice it, we just continue on. It's autopilot. And so I want to talk here about some of the things we were trained to think. And these things are very helpful as a trainee. And I know that, I don't know if any of the trainees come here, but I know you have them. And I work with a lot of fellows and I tell them that you just need to be aware of this so that when you're done with your training, this is not life sustainable. Maybe you need it in short term, but we can't do this everywhere all the time. It's also very good for the healthcare system if we think some of these ways. And so it's a little bit of a circular problem. So we need to be discerning about when we think in this way. So what are some of these thought patterns? And as I share them, I'm hoping that you will think, what are you practicing besides medicine? And these are all things you're practicing every day in your practice and potentially at home also. And one of the reasons I often bring home into it is, one, as a pediatrician, home is what it's all about. But I don't think in medicine we can separate it, because if home's not going well, work's not going well. If work's not going well, home's not going well. If we're burnt out at work, our family doesn't get the best of us. So they're pretty inseparable. So some of these thought patterns, and I will say that I had all of them at the beginning, and I still do to some degree, but I see them. The first one is catastrophizing and thinking worst case scenario, what's the worst that could happen? If I make a mistake, something terrible will happen. And this is a very expensive thought pattern. In our practice, if you are thinking about patients, it's expensive for your families and energetically and emotionally. And so noticing how you catastrophize, and many doctors immediately resonate with that, and also how it's impacting you and how it's impacting your life. Is it making you more tired? Is it making you enjoy your practice more? There are some settings, like maybe in the ICU, you should catastrophize, or maybe in the ER when someone's quoting, yes, but we don't need to do it all day, every day. And it changes our ability to connect. We tend to be perfectionists. We tend to be people pleasers. And we were trained to do that. If in residency you didn't people please, you didn't get good grades and evaluations, and you couldn't get your fellowship, and you couldn't get your job. And so we were trained to be afraid of not people pleasing, be afraid of rejection. And so I think it's really important to notice where you people please in your life, and how you can tell you're people pleasing versus just doing a really good job is you feel bitter, resentful, and exhausted. So if any of these sound familiar, you're not alone, and you're welcome to also share any of those that you have. Urgency bias is another one that I just want to reflect on. We are urgent about fixing things. We hate uncertainty, and we were trained in medicine. Uncertainty is dangerous. If you don't know there's something wrong with you, you should be hyper vigilant. You should stay up late reading and learning. And this doesn't make for a healthy career in medicine. It doesn't make for time away from work. It doesn't make for rest or restoration. And then when I was trained, a good doctor practiced self-sacrifice, martyrdom, and being a savior. And all those things don't make for a burnout-free career. They really make for someone who is sacrificed and a martyr. And so I like to say, now, this doesn't mean we don't want to care. And so I say, what would caring do rather than coming from it from this place of sacrificing and martyrdom? And I will talk a little bit about ways around some of these in a little bit. It's not all bad. I said I was going to offer hope, but the first part's not hopeful. Over responsibility is another one where we take responsibility for things that are outside of our control. And that's one of my specialties. And it's one that drips over into home a lot, but it also drips over into your clinic and maybe taking responsibility, as a primary care pediatrician for immunization rates. I can do my best, but I'm not in control of whether the patient agrees, and not all patients agree. And I think noticing where you're over responsible. Are you over responsible for your children's outcome? Are you over responsible for your partner's health, for example? One of the things that I learned with my husband's mental health struggle is that I was taking responsibility for fixing it and taking care of everyone else, which none of that was actually all my responsibility nor in my control. And when I stopped doing that and focused on myself, everybody else actually got better. Same thing for what I have named toxic independence. And that means that we're really good at things, so we do them ourselves. And we don't, we can fill out some of the things that our medical assistant or nurses don't do as quickly. We just do it ourselves because it's faster. We just call the patient back ourselves because it's faster. We put our kids to bed because it's faster when we do it and no one else. It's just, we're in this sort of urgency bias, but also we do it better. And so it's very hard for us to let other folks step in. And it's also exhausting, leads to that sense of exhaustion. So a couple more just to bring up. Judgment. We have very much a judgment culture. We judge ourselves, we judge our colleagues, and we judge our patients if you look at some of the words we use in medicine. So our patients complain of things, they don't follow, not events against medical advice, they deny, they state. And I know in psych, maybe it's not all true. And those words don't help us feel good in our practice. And we just tend to go home and judge everyone else too. And we tend to continue to judge ourselves. And so it makes for not a great supportive, compassionate living environment for ourselves or the practice of medicine. We tend to doubt ourselves, and in correlation with that, not trust others and not trust ourselves, and be hypervigilant, thinking that we can control things, we have to supervise everything. And when I trained, we couldn't trust if you were second year, you couldn't trust the intern. You had to trust and confirm. You couldn't trust the nurses. They had to, you had to see if they took things off your orders, and then you had to go to the med record and see, we didn't have electronic records then, see if they had given them the medicine. And then you had to, check with the patient, see if they actually took it, or, it was this whole sort of culture of we couldn't trust. And that carries forth. And we often, and I hate to say this, but we don't often trust our patients. They tell us stuff, but we're not really sure they do it. And so I think just realizing that that's your lens, it's not surprising that we're burnt out if we think that way. We also think, we need to research more. The more we research, the more we think about it, over ruminate, we will come up with an answer, when most of us don't get our best solutions from ruminating. There's a lot of science that you actually come up with creative solutions when you are relaxed, when you're practicing mindfulness, when you're out in nature, but that's not how we're trained in medicine. So the last couple I want to bring up are the really yucky ones, shame, blame, and guilt. And I bring these up because there's a lot of science, but when we feel shame, blame, and guilt, we release cortisol and norepinephrine. And the way that impacts your amygdala or your higher thinking centers is that they just shut down. And so while you think about maybe peer review or M&M, those are all shame-based and someone's fault. And If you think about our training, right? When I trained, and I think it's still pretty true, we ask people questions till they don't know the answer. We go into shame, we're not learning. When a patient has we'll call it an undesirable outcome, we immediately go into shame. We're not learning from that. Our brains have shut down. And so when we can see how shame, blame, and guilt play a role, we make a lot of decisions about taking extra call from guilt, or answering your pager when you're not on call from guilt, and that might be toxic independence, but it might also be guilt. So just kind of thinking about where these things, how they show up in your life at home, life at work, and what's the cost is what I like to say. And the cost can be, what I mean by that is emotional, energetic, joy, purpose, passion, connection. And then two others, which were my personal specialties, so I always like to bring those up, are negativity bias. So as a primary care doctor, I take perfectly healthy children and figure out what's wrong with them. And I notice everything that's wrong. And then I tell people how to spend all their time focusing on that, fixing it. And then you go home and you notice what's wrong with your children, and you notice what's wrong with your husband, you notice what's wrong with the clinic and why it doesn't work. That's your lens. And this isn't just a female thing either. I actually had a male OBGYN who did this in his practice, which he ran by himself. And so he's spending all day troubleshooting, problem solving, and he would go home and notice what was wrong with his children and who hadn't done their homework and why wasn't dinner on the table. And then he was wondering why he was so miserable and wasn't enjoying being a dad. And so being onto yourself that this negativity bias pours into everything we do. We notice what's wrong. We're trained to fix everything. And so we try to fix other people. I tried to fix my husband when I should have left him to all of you in psychiatry. But that's what we do because that's our training. And then victimhood is another one, which a lot of people feel like it's a sore spot. But we were trained to be victims of black clouds and white clouds and victims of the system. And when we drop into victimhood, we are disempowered. So I was a victim of the call center where I worked. They always booked people wrong. They booked too many people. They'd sent the wrong messages. They didn't give the right advice. When it's really just a building with a bunch of lovely nurses in it who are trying to do their best. And when I changed my relationship with it, my work got a lot easier. There was a lot less resistance. So that's just a bit of an example. And the last one I want to bring up before I ask you all to think about what your specialty in this is imposter and syndrome and self-doubt. And imposter syndrome is a fad word right now. And I actually think it's one of these ways of thinking that, yes, we were taught to be imposters, but it doesn't serve any of us to think we're imposters. And the story I want to share here, because it blew my mind, still is blowing my mind, but I was doing a workshop with a number of physicians, all from the same location. And there was a gentleman there who had been practicing, a white male, by the way, for 38 years. And we talked about what people's specialties were. And his specialty, when he said, I struggle the most with imposter syndrome, and my brain just blew up. And I thought, if he has imposter syndrome, I don't think there's a doctor out there who doesn't have imposter syndrome. And therefore, if we all have it, none of us are imposters. It's just how we think. Like, we were trained to think we're not enough. We were trained to be noticing what's missing, what we need to fix, how to get better. And while we espouse that as helpful, kind of like Eminem, if you're doing it from a place of being mean to yourself and cortisol, bath, stress, inducing, you're not learning, you're not growing. And so this idea of imposter syndrome, I just like to think, well, maybe it's just a word and maybe it's not actually a problem. And I invite you to just consider that story because it might make you feel a little better about it. So thinking for a moment, pause and think what your specialty is in amongst those. You can share it in the chat box. Many people put in the chat box all of them, and that's fine too. But noticing what you're practicing besides medicine, and also thinking for a minute, how do these habits, practices impact your life and your practice? And I'll just give you a minute to think about that. And I would also ask, are they causing you harm? And reminding you that we all took an oath to do no harm. And I like to bring this up. those of you like me who graduated before 2017, you actually didn't take an oath to do no harm to yourself. You took an oath to do no harm to others. Anyone after 2017 also took an oath to do no harm to themselves. They changed it. And so if you didn't take that one, I invite you to retake it and just include that. And how I like to frame that, there's a lot of work or popular culture around putting your own oxygen mask on first. And many doctors can't do that, but we can put ours on also. And so I like this idea of do no harm to yourself and others. Put on your own oxygen mask as well. And a lot of people can start there. So I invite you to think about that. So at this point, I'm going to switch to the good stuff, the hope and the inspiring part. And the good news about all these thought patterns is we can change them. Science shows we can retrain our brain apparently till we're 90. I don't know if my brain's going to be retrainable then, but apparently that's true. So I like to call it this the school of unlearning. And that's not my own phrase. I got that phrase from, there's a favorite book I have called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. And if you haven't read it, you should find it. I get no money from it since this is CME. It's just a beautiful book with beautiful pictures. They made it into a short movie that actually won an Academy Award, but the book is infinitely better than the movie. And each page has this wisdom. And there's one page where he says, I wish there was a school of unlearning. So that's what I call this. And the school of unlearning basically takes this concept that what you practice grows and what you don't practice recedes. So once you figure out what you're practicing besides medicine, you can figure out whether you want to keep practicing that or practice it less and practice some of these other habits that I'm going to talk about more. And it took a lot of time to develop these habits. Many of you had them before you went to medical school because that's how you got in. And so it takes time to undo them, and it takes actually time where you're paying attention and thinking about undoing them. They don't just undo on their own. And most of these patterns were hardwired during time of trauma, and most of you as psychiatry actually know a lot more about trauma than I do. But things that are hardwired during trauma are stickier and harder to unwire. So just having compassion for yourself, I consider all of residency trauma in my mind to some degree. And I haven't found anyone who disagrees with me. So recognizing that you learn these in trauma, so they are stickier. And I do actually work with some people who are not in medicine, and their coaching is twice as fast as the doctors, if not infinitely faster. And so I think just having compassion for ourselves, that these are deeply rooted thought patterns in your brain, and they take time to unwire. So giving yourself time. And so how do we unwind them? First of all, we have to know they're there. That's why I went through them all. And I didn't actually go through them all. I went through about half of them. And so realizing that there's a lot more work to be done, or half of the ones that I have thought of, I actually keep thinking of more. There's a lot of work to be done to notice them. Really, your work is to be aware. And so the second, number one is to be aware when they're, what you're practicing, when they're useful, when they're not. And number two would be to slow down and get out of the fight or flight. We don't change anything or rewire anything when you are in fight or flight, feeling threatened, being chased by a tiger, as they say. That makes perfect sense. So slowing down, getting out of fight or flight, noticing what you're doing and how you're showing up. And then number three is practicing self-compassion. We can't be mean to ourselves to change. Many of us try to do this willpower thing. We're experts at it. We were taught that in medicine. But realizing that you can't actually hate yourself into change or be mean to yourself, the science shows that. So we in medicine have to develop some practice of self-compassion. That hand to heart is one. That's a physical one that's easy to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but recognizing that the first step of self-compassion is just not being mean to yourself and noticing when you are. And I know from experience that every doctor I know is at least surreptitiously mean to themselves, if not outwardly mean to themselves. Why didn't I get enough done? Why haven't I done this? Why am I not home earlier? Like there's just, it's infinite, honestly. So beginning to notice that is the first step. Number four is you have to replete yourself in order to change. So if you're on negative, below empty, we don't change. If your basic needs are not being met, you actually go into sympathomimic storm and you don't change. And so this one, a lot of people say, I don't have time to do that. And my thought is you don't have time not to, first of all, and it's not that hard. You can take a few deep breaths. You can go outside for 5 minutes. You can go into nature, stick your head out the window. You probably have windows that don't open because that's true, but go outside at lunchtime for 5 minutes. Thinking about small things, and I actually would recommend you make a list of things that replete you, big and little. A lot of us say, well, my vacation's gonna replete me, but you can't do that once or twice a year or 4 times a year and be okay in the work that you do. So noticing little things, is it tea? Is it flowers on your desk? Is it, I used to breathe with my patients. It's funny because they're kids, right? But I noticed that when I had my stethoscope on it, and I know you don't breathe, but you can find something different. When I was breathing, the patients would breathe and then the parents would breathe, and then my visits would be way better. So even pausing or doing hand to heart yourself, and maybe just sitting there doing it in a pause, and your patients will see. If nothing else, do it in your office before you go in the room, or at the door before you go in the room. You can put your hand on the door handle and take 3 breaths. That's repletion. And then the number 5 is to practice these new ways of intentional thinking and acting. And that's growing the practice you want and doing less of the others. So 1 and 2 are mindfulness, essentially. And many people think you have to meditate. And I know most of you don't have time for 45 minutes of meditation. If you do, great, do it. If you can do it. And I again, like to be transparent that I couldn't do it. That's why I went to yoga, because you can move in yoga and you're in the class and someone's talking to you. And so that's my practice of mindfulness. And I do better being in my body than sitting on a mat. But you can also just breathe. That helps. You can literally pause and slow down. You can do force bathing. You can do just sitting in the sunshine. You can do 5 senses. There's so many different ways of practicing mindfulness. You can use any app. It doesn't matter to me which one. For 3 minutes, 5 minutes, makes a huge difference. Even 1 minute makes a difference. The science says 12 minutes that's what all the evidence-based studies, but in my personal experience, it's dose dependent. So if you don't have 12, some is better than none. And you'll actually want to do more when you get better at it. When you first start, it is so uncomfortable. So the purpose of mindfulness is to rebalance your nervous system, upregulate that parasympathetic and downregulate your sympathetic, and then you can make change. So if you think about things that for you do that, it could actually be just music. That could be mindfulness, or not listening to something constantly. Even monotasking is mindfulness, which is going to feel better. And mindfulness feels better for a number of reasons, but one of them is the neurochemicals, neuromodulators that get released. So mindfulness releases oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine. And I always like I know that psychiatrists, you're all very familiar with those. So you want to be releasing more of those, because when you release more of those, you create what I call the neurochemical soup that tastes better, is healthier, and helps you make change and live in more alignment. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, because self-compassion works the same way, a healthy soup. And then mindfulness has this other piece, which really helps my doctor mind get out of some of those thought patterns. So I think of these tenets, I call them tenets. I think John Kabat-Zinn calls them attitudes, and everybody in mindfulness has different words, doesn't matter what they are. They're basically the main concepts or approaches or beliefs that are behind mindfulness. And I have decided to name them, they're the Narcan of those thought patterns. They are basically the antidote of the thought patterns. And so if I show up mindfully, and I'll tell you what these all are, then I don't have to worry about untraining shame, blame, and guilt. I don't have to worry about untraining my people pleasing, because I'm focusing on something I want, which if you're using your brain for you, that works better. When we set an intention, i.e. to show up mindfully, we're already releasing dopamine and acetylcholine, which motivate you. So again, this is kind of thinking like, how can I use my brain for me? My brain, we're so good about what patients need to do, but not our own. So the tenets of mindfulness, if you were to decide to show up mindfully, are that noticing and awareness, so being aware of your thought patterns, non-judgment, so immediately you're out of the judgment, but also the shame, blame, and guilt. Non-striving. One of the patterns I didn't mention today was more is less, hard is better. So non-striving for outcomes. Attention. So choosing what you focus your attention on. So we say what you pay attention to is your life. And if you have that negativity bias, like we actually all do, when our brain isn't told what to focus on, it goes negative. And doctors were about that on steroids. Because that's what we do all day, is a habit. So learning to focus your attention on the positive, or a lot of people get upset because they say, well, you're trying to just tell me to think positive. Just be a little more balanced. If you could just focus a little less on the negative, 1%, 5%, you'll feel better. Generosity is another one, and you are all super generous people, I happen to know. But what this means is generosity of thinking, staying out of catastrophizing, thinking positive intent, trusting others a little bit more. I'm not asking for like blind trust, but noticing how you can trust yourself. Where have you made good decisions? Where are others making good decisions? Patience is one of these tenets of mindfulness. That one's really hard for me, but it's the opposite of urgency bias. And if for any of you are parents, that's super helpful. Kindness and compassion is one. Letting go is one. So letting go of the things that are outside of your control. And to be fair, many of us were taught that we could control things we can't control. And that leads to anxiety and exhaustion and burnout. And so letting go of those things. And then curiosity is one other, which for me is a really helpful one. And I can't ever say that without our former CEO at Kaiser used to tell us that we were supposed to show up curious, not furious. And it used to make me angry. But now I'm like, oh, that's the curiosity and that's mindfulness. And it's not that I'm doing it for someone else. I'm actually doing it for me because it feels better to show up that way than judgmentally, for example. It just creates more of a healthy soup. And it's really helpful if you're a parent of teenagers, which I still have one more to go. So I'm going to move on to self-compassion. And self-compassion, scientific studies show it releases oxytocin. So if you think about the oxytocin, turns on your higher brain function, makes you more creative if you're thinking about neural patterns and willing to change. So in and of itself, it's helpful. It's also the opposite of shame, blame, and guilt. And so it keeps us, self-compassion keeps us out of that reactive autopilot. So the hand to heart I mentioned, and that is something that I actually practice. See, I'm doing, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm doing it right now. And I use it all the time now because once you practice it, it feels really good. You can even use it in a patient encounter. I will often say, that's a hand to heart moment. Like, so it's just something difficult. And you're sort of means you're acknowledging that you're human, they're human, we have human hearts. Our human hearts have needs. And there's a lot of science around self-compassion. So I choose that one because it's super easy. And I will offer, though, it takes tremendous practice. And so could you practice in the morning? Could you practice in the evening? There are lots of different ways to do it. Don't make it hard. Just see how it feels and try it out. Once you do it, you'll actually become addicted to it. You can do it anytime. And none of you are in the OR, so there's no reason you can't do it. It also is releasing that healthy neurochemical soup. It's helping your brain shift and change. So once you've done these things and you have this healthier soup, that's when you can start to work on your brain. And essentially coaching is when you work on your brain, though many people need coaching to do all of those first things as well, to even notice. And really noticing is a huge part of the coaching. But I believe that you can't actually coach someone well and have it stick and last without the mindfulness and self-compassion, because you're working against physiology. And I'm actually certain all of the psychiatrists will agree with me. But a lot of people want the, executive leadership coaching. Let me just figure out how to get that outcome. And that is not actually what physicians need. We're amazing at it. And it's actually not what leaders need either. I coach a lot of leaders, and you need self-compassion. If you're going to lead with a lens to wellness, you need to be mindful. You need to be aware of all these thought patterns and where you're catastrophizing and making decisions from fear and mistakes. So I'm going to give you just a couple things at the end that you can try. There's so much to the coaching world. And what I thought I would talk about is asking good questions here, because I think it's something that you can take with you. And so I'm going to give you 5 questions to ask yourself as a start. And first off, notice the bad questions you ask. Like, what if this turns out terribly? What if I get in trouble? What if I get sued? What if this patient harasses me. I know that happens in psych a lot, or, all those things, the negative what ifs. So shifting your focus to positive questions. And I'm going to borrow here 3 questions that come from Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. She's a internal medicine doctor. She's actually 86 or 87 now, but she created the program called The Healer's Art, which is in many medical schools. And she wrote Kitchen Table Wisdom and My Grandfather's Blessing and some other stuff. They're great books, and she is full of wisdom. And these are her 3 anti-burnout questions. So the 3 questions are: what inspired you today? What surprised you? And what touched your heart? And she recommends that you ask them for 21 days at the end of the day. You can even ask them at the end of a unit. You can ask them, but I recommend you try it. They shift your focus a little bit more towards the positive without being Pollyanna. It helps you connect with what you enjoy with your work. And they're creative enough that our brain is kind of willing to answer them. And you can even ask that, what touched your heart, with hand to heart, because it makes it even, drops you into your body so you can connect with your brain and body in the same spot. And then the one that I add to this is, what did you do well today? Because we all know what we did wrong. We are totally negativity, bias focused. We are fixers, managers, and controllers. And that question is very specific. It's not what went well today, which feels Pollyanna to me, and also focusing on what's out of our control. So this is, what did you do well? It helps you get out of that imposter syndrome. It's a great question. And if you have children, ask them that question too. That's my pediatric advice, adding that in here. And then my absolute favorite question is number 5, which is going to seem not medicine related, but it is. And in Vietnam, actually, their hospitals are, the name they use is translated House of Love. And I don't know the exact word, nor would I be able to say it well, but their hospitals are houses of love. And the question that I like to ask is, what would love do? And I ask this question because love is sort of this activating, energizing force that always makes good decisions. And while we may not love our patients, we do kind of have like love for humanity with them and love for health. And so the way to ask this question, though, is not the way you think. You're going to ask what love would do for you first. So if you're considering staying late, or you're considering squeezing in a patient, or you're considering picking up an extra call, you could ask yourself this question: what would love do for me, you as the physician? What would love do for that patient, for that colleague? What would love do for your family? What would love do for your partner? What would love do for your department, for the practice of medicine, for society? You can play it out as far as you want. And you start with yourself, and then you go to the next important thing. And when you play all that out, you usually get a good answer that works for everyone. It immediately locks your brain into that creative thinking, and it gets you out of making decisions from fear and guilt, which is what we do. Will I get in trouble? Will somebody be mad at me? Gets you out of self-sacrifice and martyrdom, for example. So if you combine it with hand to heart, again, you're actually getting your body's wisdom, which in medicine, we were taught to ignore our body, but you in psych know that you can't ignore. Body and mind are actually related. So that helps me answer the question. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I also have to close my eyes because I am someone who's always assessing the situation, as many of you are. And so I can't listen if I have my eyes open. So you might try that too. And then I like to think, okay, well, what would love do? And I think love would create this neurochemical soup. It would be aware of it. It would not waste your energy on expensive things or things out of your control. Love would focus only on what's in your control. It would notice what's not out of your control. Where are you trying to fix, manage, control, all those things that are out of your control, and let it go. Love would speak up, though. I often think people say, well, this just means I'm going to think positively and I'm not going to complain. Well, it wouldn't complain, but love would advocate for change in your department if there's policies that don't work, or love would advocate for your own health. Love would speak up if you need help. Love would also care for you and include you in that Hippocratic oath, or care for yourself as well. And I also like to ask it this way: love would opt out of maybe victimhood, shame, blame, guilt, cortisol baths, whatever it is that is your sticky spot. Love would usually opt out of those things that cause you harm. And I do want to add this last caveat, which is that I have learned over time that in some cultures, love actually does self-sacrifice, and it does cause it self-harm, and it does feel blame, shame, and guilt. So especially in the mom role. And so if that happens to be you, pick a different word that works. And so I find in medicine, what would peace do is a really useful one, or what would sustainability do, something that you want. So if that word really doesn't work for you, I sometimes use what would caring do, because I want to be a caring person, or what would kindness do. But for almost everybody that I know in medicine, this love bit, it reminds you of why you went into medicine. Most of us chose it because we love it. We chose it because there was a purpose and there was a passion. And so asking that question is a bit like preventive care for burnout, along with Rachel and Naomi Redmond's questions. So I'm hoping that at least gives you some things to think about and try, and that I hope this is a little bit of hope and a little bit of inspiration and a little bit of aha moments, so that you will head back to your afternoon, maybe choosing one thing that you can do, and remembering this idea that medicine should be different, and or sometimes your teenagers should be different, or the clinic should be different, or the schedule should be different, but how can you still make a difference? And then look at those things and figure out one thing you want to try.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Mahoney. And yeah, I really certainly myself resonated with several of those thought patterns you discussed. And so appreciate the opportunity to explore some of the remedies or preventative care, like you mentioned. Cool. Well, let's open it up. If anyone has questions, please feel free to jump in the chat or unmute. I'll try to watch for hands.
Hi, I'll jump in. I'm Timothy Kane, child psychiatrist. It's really interesting. I had never thought about kind of the way we were raised in medicine, and being, subject to luck or the lack of luck, white cloud, black cloud. It's really interesting when you said that it's so much in our cells that it just never occurred to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My absolute pleasure. It never occurred to me until I started. It's not that it didn't occur to me. It really took me about 20 years of being in wellness, and then adding in the coaching lens. I think that to me was like, wow. And what I found most interesting is when I did my own coaching, my coach didn't know any of these things, but she started to point out that I thought in really strange ways she'd never heard of or thought of. She interestingly was married to a doctor, and she was like, oh, my husband says that. And so I think it was just this sort of, and I'll call that luck that I was someone who had worked in this and then did the coaching. And I also did mindfulness at the exact same time, and my yoga training at the exact same time. And I'm certain that it was the synergy of those that made me more open to it. The other thing that I learned in my own coaching, which I didn't mention today, is that this person was really into this idea of play and lightness. And she said that she noticed in me as a physician that that was the only way to get me out of these thought patterns, where I would consider another option and get out of my catastrophizing. And so I just think it's interesting to think about that lightness. And as you think about these thought patterns, please don't judge yourself. And it's not an idea to go into shame, blame, and guilt. It's like, once you know it, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You're going to notice, and there's many more, but I think you also have to start small and begin with the one that you practice. Just work on one at a time. Love it. Anyone else have questions, comments?
One other comment. I do talk to my fellows and residents and medical students about unlearning what they're learning or what we have learned. And I tell a story I remember as a general resident when I was working in outpatient peds urgent care. And there was a peds resident. I love our peds residents. They work very hard here, who walked in with an IV pole and with a mask on. And I thought, isn't that the most interesting thing? And they really praised her for coming in and continuing with clinic. And she was I mean, she had been obviously very sick. And I just thought at the time, what an odd way to be trained in terms of, the idea of putting one's mask on first. And that is quite the opposite to that. But there's definitely a sense of you get kudos when, you work really hard, you get kudos when, in our department, not the case if you show up sick, but
I was going to say, I think COVID taught us that a little bit, thankfully.
No, that's definitely not who we are here, but it's really interesting how our training and who we ultimately become really changes us as individuals.
And I think you get to decide who you want to be now. And it's probably not none of what you are. I think we still want to be caring and responsible. It's just a shift towards something that is, I like to think about it, sustainable is the way that I think about, like, that's the highest bar. And I can dive into a sustainable world would be the highest bar. So sustainable medicine would be the highest bar. And I think our brain says, well, that's low bar and that means compromising. But I think if something is sustainable, that's actually the highest bar in medicine, right? And good care, quality of care is sustainable, right? So not caring is not sustainable. So it actually is a bit like love that can direct you in that way of thinking your thought patterns. Is it a sustainable thought pattern? Maybe it's sustainable to practice it in one setting, but not in all of them.
Okay, like lots of positive comments in the chat, and thanks for sharing the book title again. Yeah, I definitely feel like this kind of work has been really valuable in terms of my own evolution, and also thinking about kind of how we transmute our own experiences that we've had into medicine and our roles in leadership with educating and leadership for our learners with newer generations. So really appreciate the inspiration. And yeah, I'll just share also, there are certainly opportunities to follow Dr. Mahoney online or social media if some of this was resonated with you, struck a chord today. So yeah, thank you again so much for your time. Thank you for being with us this afternoon and teaching us.
My pleasure. And I'm totally open if people want to email me too. People do often after I talk, and something pops in their head and they're like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. So feel free to email me. I assume someone will share my information, but it's Jessie at jessiemahoney.md.com. So it's not too hard. You'll find me. Beautiful. Nice to meet you all. Have an amazing afternoon. And please take a pause and a few deep breaths before you start your next venture this afternoon.